Nuclear is too expensive to build and run and too long to get online. In 30 years' time, when our first reactor would be online, green energy will be 30 years more advanced. What do you have to say to that?
There is not enough copper in Mother Earth to decarbonise the world. We were seeing mountaintops being blown out for renewable energy projects. Nothing could prepare me for what I'm seeing up there. I never thought I'd ever see this.
Seems like a complete oxymoron that you would take trees out of the ground to clean the environment.
With the renewable projects, these are going into old growth remnant forests, the best of the best of the best that is left.
Tell us what you started to see.
You're watching the JJ Podcast.
Well, we are here with wildlife photographer and former Greens candidate, Steven Nowakowski. And Steven, thank you so much for your time today. Yeah. Before we get into the podcast, I think it's really important that we talk about your background for context as to why this topic is so important to you. So for our listeners who might not have seen your work or seen you on Sky or heard you on the radio, just tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Jamie and Jamie. My background is one that has come from nature. I grew up in the Blue Mountains, just west of here, west of Sydney, and formed a deep love and respect for nature and wilderness areas. And from a very young age, I've had a connection with nature. And I suppose that's sort of been the building blocks of my life. I got involved with the Brisbane Bushwalking Club to try to get out into more wilderness areas when I moved from the Blue Mountains to Queensland. And then I quickly learned of the destruction of nature for various projects. And I got very involved in many projects or campaigns, such as the Wild Rivers campaign in Cape York, the broad-scale land clearing that was occurring across North Queensland. But more than anything, it was actually the Port Hinchinbrook campaign back in the early 90s. And that led me to actually move to North Queensland to be more active in that campaign. And that campaign centred around the construction of a 500-berth marina at Cardwell opposite Hinchinbrook Island and within the World Heritage Area. And the marina at the time in the early 90s was as big as the Cairns Marina. And I could envisage a lot of high-speed ferries and watercraft going to Hinchinbrook Island, the Brook Islands, Garden Island, and turning the Hinchinbrook region into the Whitsundays. And that was a really bad, well, I thought a very bad thing for that region because it was a very wild place. And then I quickly started a project on writing a book about the area. And that's where my photographic career sort of launched from. And that book was very successful. And then I moved into photography as a career.
The photography is then what has set you on this new journey where 4 years ago you began mapping Australia's renewable developments. Let's start off by just talking about how the photography is what led to this epiphany. Tell us what you started to see.
Yeah, so just taking a back step, I was very involved with the conservation sector for 30 years and involved with the FNQ, Far North Queensland Greens Party. I ran as a candidate in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I actually worked as a contract photographer for the Australian Conservation Foundation, Greenpeace, Queensland Conservation Council, as a freelance photographer, documenting broad-scale land clearing events or breaches to the Vegetation Management Act. And I was their person on the ground documenting destruction of wild habitats, mostly for land clearing for beef, really. And then what I saw happening was the destruction, the commencement of the rollout of renewables across North Queensland. So I'm also very involved with an organisation called Rainforest Reserves Australia. So we plant trees, we revegetate, we reforest, I create corridors between protected areas. We also run the Cassowary Rehabilitation Centre in North Queensland. And it takes us 5 years or so to rehabilitate 5 hectares of degraded land. Yet on our doorstep, we were seeing mountaintops being blown out for renewable energy projects, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of hectares of forests. And these are just not regrowth forests like I was doing for the Australian Conservation Foundation and WWF and photographing land clearing for beef, because most of that land clearing is done on what we call regrowth forests, so Category X, which is the category under the Vegetation Management Act. And so a lot of that land clearing is regrowth. So the biodiversity is quite limited. Whereas with the renewable projects, these are going into old growth remnant forests, the best of the best of the best that is left. So these are the high mountaintops. And it's these mountaintops that our scientists are telling us that we need to preserve as refugia areas in a warming climate. Yet these mountains are now being destroyed.
Yeah.
So, and this was the hypocrisy of what we were seeing. And so that's when I started documenting the destruction of these mountaintops for renewable projects.
So you just mentioned that you were a former Greens candidate in Queensland, and now your job is obviously the photography, the mapping, the patricians to show people the sheer scale in this stuff. And you just mentioned that word hypocrisy, and that's what I think we're starting to see, and certainly what our audience is starting to see with the whole Greens movement, is they're kind of like, where are you? So my question to you now would be, with what you are unveiling, what has been the response from A, the Greens Party, and B, the government in general?
Well, they're both working in lockstep. So the conservation sector is working with the Federal Labor Party. And you have to remember that the recent Nature Reform Bill, the EPBC reform, that was done first and foremost to fast-track renewables and critical mineral mining and rare earth mining to facilitate the fast-tracking of renewables. I've been campaigning for 20 years in the various roles I've had in conservation groups for reforms to the old EPBC Act because it was very deficient, okay? It still enabled inappropriate developments to occur. And we'd been campaigning for 2 decades for reforms. All of a sudden, we have a $1 trillion renewable energy juggernaut coming in behind us, and they're saying this act is slowing us down, we need reforms, and Murray Watt goes, we'll reform it in 2 weeks. And that's exactly what happened. So those reforms were done to fast-track renewables.
Unnecessary homework's not being done.
I blame the Greens, I blame the conservation sector for pushing that through. And if you look at the ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and all over their social media, they're saying they deserve all the accolades for these reforms, whereas these reforms are not going to save nature at all. It's really back to business. This is business as usual. And in actual fact, it's actually going to be worse because these renewables in Queensland, in particular, are going into the best of the best remnant forests. We're going to see destruction. Nothing could prepare me for what I'm seeing up there. I never thought I'd ever see this. So in Queensland, we had the Vegetation Management Act in place under state government, and that was our backstop piece of legislation, where it was even for a farmer to clear classified old growth forest was very difficult. And to clear the tops of mountains was completely impossible. Yet now the renewable energy sector can go in there and do that. And this is why the regional communities are pushing back so much, because they're saying, well, we can't even clear forests to build a dam or punch a fence line through or put a stockyard in. We can't even do that. Yet I look up the mountains and they're being blasted out by multinational companies with no sediment control, no erosion control. And they're going, what the hell? So that's why we're seeing so much pushback now in the regional communities, because of the hypocrisy. They can't do things on their land because they're prohibited, but the multinational companies are. Companies like Neoen, which is French-owned, DP Energy, which is an Irish company.
So they're not Australian companies.
No, the only Australian companies that I know that are in the renewable space is really Andrew Forrest, which is Squadron Energy and Winlab. So it's crazy times.
And one thing I think that is also not really spoken about too much is the afterlife of these wind turbines, and in particular the blades, because it's often spoken about that the tower aspect can be recycled, but the blades can't because of the minerals that are used to make up these enormous blades. And I was reading an American recycling fact sheet, sort of a tongue twister saying fact sheet, and they are estimating that if the current recycling methods don't change, by 2050, there'll be 2.2 million tons worth of landfill of blades in the US. Just talk to us about what is it about the minerals that are being used within these blades that means that these elements can't be recycled or reused on another wind turbine?
Yes, look, it's an evolving industry and it's a very new industry. And every year the technology is changing. The technology is getting bigger and bigger. The turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The very first wind farm in Queensland, industrial scale wind farm, the Mount Emerald wind farm, those wind towers were about 160, 170 metres or 150 metres high, whereas the new generation are around 250 metres high. So the blades at Mount Emerald were 56 metres long. The new ones going into central Queensland are around 86 metres long. These are 30-tonne blades. The nacelle, the centre gearbox, is between 300 and 400 tonne, full of critical minerals and rare earths. And the recycling is not there at all, really, particularly in Australia. It doesn't exist. There's so many elements to this story. And for me, it's not necessarily about the recyclability of the componentry of these turbines. It's more so the amount of critical mineral and rare earth mining that is required to build the kit, because we need so much of it. So we need so much copper and graphite and lithium.
I'm right in understanding that we used to have quite a big lithium mining trade here in Australia, and now apparently, because there was that thing on dirty nickel and lithium and all that I think Spotlight exposed.
That's right. So the nickel in Indonesia.
It's moved to Indonesia.
Yes.
And apparently the way in which they mine it is far dirtier than the way in which we were doing it. But we're de-industrialising our nations. So
yeah, that's right. So all the critical mineral mining is being done in countries that don't have the environmental safeguards in place. So Indonesia, the Congo is the big one. So the Congo, where there's nickel cobalt. So the cobalt, which is required for all of this technology, is being done by slave labour, child labour. It's horrendous, and it's all Chinese controlled. All the mining in Africa is controlled by the Chinese. It's all a closed shop, and what they're doing is they're undercutting Australian mining. So we're deindustrialising. What I want to say too, look, I believe in climate change. I would like to see, obviously a reduction in fossil fuels. However, what we're seeing with the coal extraction in Australia, we're plateauing in terms of coal extraction. But what has happened in Indonesia, they've taken the slack, and now they're going gangbusters with coal extraction, and they're just going through the roof. And that coal is dirtier than what comes out of Australia. There's no environmental safeguards. And we've actually moved all of our energy sovereignty is now going over to other countries.
which is silly when we've got everything. We've got everything.
Yeah, so if we need base load, we actually need base load, okay? So when we need heat processing, which comes from heat. And so things like chemical processing, glass production, we've actually lost our glass production, lime and cement production, desalination. If we want to go down the path of desalination, we really can't do any of that with just wind, sun and batteries. So what's happening? So what we're doing is we're moving all of our industry over to Indonesia, India or China, who is building all this kit for us, and then we're shipping it all back.
Yeah.
And
doing it in the name of green.
And it all wears out in 20 years and then do it all again.
Can you take us back to cobalt? When we were off air, you were talking about how there's not enough cobalt.
No,
with its
copper.
copper.
Yes.
to be able to manufacture enough of these 31,000 wind turbines that we need. But then also when they are expired and you need to do it all over again, that the earth physically doesn't have enough of that mineral to be able to accommodate all of it.
Yeah, so from a sustainability point of view, it doesn't last.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So look, I was a true believer in renewables, that we could continue our quality of life in Australia by transitioning to wind, sun and batteries. I honestly thought you could do that. And also our transport infrastructure. So transition all of our internal combustion engines to electric, whatever that is, tens and tens of millions of cars and forklifts and heavy trucks and buses. But I honestly thought that. But what really turned me around was Professor Simon Michaud's work from the University of Queensland. And he has been seconded over to the Finnish mineralogy department. And he was tasked with the project of identifying what is the quantity of critical minerals and rare earths that we need globally for the world to transition to net zero. So he did this monumental piece of work, and it's on YouTube, and I watched that, and that just blew my brain. He's made it very, very clear that there is not enough copper in Mother Earth to decarbonise the world, to get everything moved over to electric. So if, what's the population of China? I don't know, 1.4 billion. The population of India.
Similar.
If all of these, if the world's population all moves over to electric, there is not enough copper to do that. And the thing is, that's all for one generation of renewables. So you've got to build all the wind towers, build all the solar panels, all the batteries. That lasts for, say, 15, 20, 25 years. And then you need to do it all again. You need more copper, more copper, more copper, more copper. And that's what really turned me around. I thought, this isn't going to work long term. Here in Australia, we can go down this path and try to achieve, I don't believe we can get to net zero just on wind, sun and batteries. I believe it's unachievable. We can try. We're going to do a lot of damage, both to our environment, our quality of life, our industry, our economy. From my perspective, it's just the environment. The environment needs to take a really big hit to try to do what we're trying to do.
And don't trees decarbonize the air anyway? Like this is what we're seeing a lot on our socials. Is like it seems like a complete oxymoron that you would take trees out of the ground to clean the environment.
Yeah, and that's right. And that's
the atmosphere.
That's exactly right. So what we're seeing in Queensland, just Queensland alone, Jeanette Kemp, who is a fantastic botanist, she does a lot of great work in Northern Australia. I've given her, my organisation has given her the mapping for renewables in Queensland, and she's done a bit of an analysis, and she's identified that we need to clear 30,000 hectares of old growth forest in Queensland just for wind farms. Now, the sequestration coming out of that forest is immense. And this isn't regrowth. This is old growth. This is old trees with nesting dens for greater gliders and squirrel gliders and feather-tail gliders, full of koalas, full of biodiversity. And you have to remember, biodiversity is our backstop to climate change, and we're destroying our biodiversity. So the first thing we need to do to address climate change is keep trees in the ground. Yet the entire conservation sector is turning a blind eye to the blasting out of our mountains and our biodiversity to try to fix climate change. It's again, the word hypocrisy just keeps coming up over and over and over.
Tell us about the cement aspect of these wind turbines, because we've spoken about the blades and the tower, but the sheer volume of cement that is required for every single individual turbine. Where does that go? When the turbine's reached its extended life, 20 years, what happens to that amount of cement?
Yes, look, I've photographed the construction of these wind tower foundations.
Yes, yeah.
They're huge. Now, with the new generation of towers that go up to about 250 metres high, those foundations are around 1,000 cubic metres of concrete, of cement, reinforced cement, because there's a lot of steel in there. I can't remember the quantity of steel, but it's just huge. 1,000 cubic metres. Now, for an average home, an average 3-bedroom home, that requires about 28 cubic metres of cement. And you have to remember that production of cement is the second highest emitter of carbon dioxide, that industry. Now, we need to build around 31,000 wind towers in Australia, so you can do the sums, 31,000 times 1,000 cubic metres. Now, when those wind towers retire, they can't be recycled. So those foundations need to be the overburden or soil needs to be put over the top, and then they need to rock break, or I see them using dynamite. It's a lot cheaper than rock breaking machines, and blast out the foundation hole, and then do it all again. So again, this is what I mean by Professor Simon Michaud's work, because he's sort of analysed how much cement do we need for the world to decarbonise, and if you can expect, China to try to do this, and they'd need hundreds and hundreds of thousands of wind towers, and they need to do that every 20, 25 years, the amount of cement that's required, the amount of CO2 emitted in the production of that cement is astronomical.
And it's not only I think people get a visual, right? People who aren't obviously in the game you're in, where they think about the base and the foundation of the concrete, they think about the tower of the turbine, and they think about the spitting blades.
Yes.
But what they don't visualize is that to get the foundation, to get the dynamite, to get the stuff, you've got to clear the road all in here to get there, to do it. Yeah. And then once it's creating energy, you then need to blow out all these trees and pathways and make roads in the other way for transmission lines.
Yeah,
and so you get a lot of people saying, oh, you don't speak out against fossil fuels or you don't speak out against nuclear. I think for me, the thing that I have a very limited understanding with nuclear, but it was that they planned to put nuclear reactors where there are current coal-fueled fire stations. The structure is there. You're not talking about destroying new. So are you
that's exactly
now? What do you think?
That's exactly right. Just going back to those concrete foundations, it's actually the fatigue in the cement, so they need to do them again, and that's the problem with the foundations. So in Queensland, we don't have wind resources like you do here in New South Wales on the coast and Victoria, Tasmania. So they need to go up into the high country to get the wind resources, which are also close to the high voltage lines that run up the Great Dividing Range. So they need to smash up into the mountains to get that wind resource. So the topography is very up and down. It's very rugged. Hence why the forest is still there, because it's too hard to build houses. It's too hard to clear for agriculture. The farmers don't really stock the cattle in high stocking rates because it's hard to muster. So that's why there's high biodiversity. But they need to build roads 50 to 60 metres wide to get the heavy infrastructure up there. Like I mentioned before, the nacelles, the centre gearboxes are 300 tonne. So they need to get an 800 tonne crane to the top of the mountain and bench the mountain to get the crane to lift a 300 tonne nacelle or an 85 metre blade. And they need to clear a big swathe of the forest because of the sweep of the blade getting up the mountain. Now, it's different in New South Wales and Victoria, where all the landscape has already been cleared for certain projects, but in North Queensland, with what I'm seeing, that is what happens. So I've had to go back and look at energy, and I knew nothing about energy and up until about 4 years ago, until I started documenting the Mount Emerald wind farm, which I was very supportive of, because that was our first wind farm. I thought, wow, that's going to provide power to 90,000 homes or 93,000 homes, the politicians were telling us, and the developer. And I thought, wow, that means we can put our toaster on in the morning. We're using wind power from the adjacent wind farm. We're carbon neutral. That's great. But then lo and behold, then there was another one proposed next door, then another one, and now we have a continuous string of wind farms right down the Great Dividing Range, because we need to overbuild, because wind farms only run at 20 to 25% capacity factors, maybe 30%, offshore's a bit higher. So that's why we need to overbuild and build so many wind farms or wind towers to harness that resource. We need to harvest this resource wherever it seems to be blowing. We need to harvest it and generate the electricity. And we need to move that electricity vast amounts of area, because we need to get the electricity out from the regions back into where it's being consumed in the cities. And that is a very expensive exercise. And that's why Chris Bowen says that we need to build 6,000 kilometres of new transmission lines, because we need to move all of this intermittent, unreliable energy generation around vast networks to get it back to where it's being consumed. And you have to remember around 43% of your electricity bill is transmission and distribution. So I've had to really think about energy and the whole idea that electricity is going to get cheaper because the wind and the sun is free is a completely ridiculous argument, because we need to build so much infrastructure and then we need to move that energy around. We need to store it in really expensive batteries. We need to build very expensive pumped hydro. I think the Snowy Hydro 2.0 has now reached 20 billion. There's calls for it to be completely abandoned because the cost of energy coming out of that.
What was the original? I was going to say, I thought it was 4 billion, 2 billion.
2 billion, it's up to 20 billion, but it's going to go way beyond that.
You just dump it. That's phenomenal.
It may go to, I don't know. But the issue is the cost of that energy is going to be so prohibitive that it's never going to pay for itself.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. So energy is not going to be cheaper. And this is what I get so frustrated about, because all we hear in the mass media is energy is going to be cheaper, cheaper, cheaper. Yet we're going to destroy our environment. We're going to deindustrialise. We're going to have it in far more expensive energy. So I've had to put all my ideology aside regarding energy, because I believe in climate change. I want to see decarbonisation. Renewables are not going to do it. And Simon Michel has made that very clear. We just don't have the resources, the critical minerals to do that. And then a very good mate of mine, Simon Thompson, who works up in North Queensland in national parks, and he said, Stephen, look, I'm a nuclear supporter. Just go away and read some books about nuclear, revisit nuclear. And that's what I've done. So I've had to put all my ideology aside and look at nuclear again. And I believe that is the no-brainer. I think nuclear is an incredible energy generation source.
Plus, it's emissions free.
And it's emissions.
And we just so happen to have the biggest amount of the world's uranium.
If it wasn't emissions free, I probably wouldn't support it. But because it's emissions free, it's a miracle. It's a miracle energy source. Yeah. And so I had to do a lot of research, and I've had to be really careful, because what's happened now is, because I'm coming out today and on other different media outlets saying nuclear has to be a part of the energy mix. And what the conservation sector is now doing is going, oh, well, we need to distance ourselves from Steven because he's pro-nuclear. So it must be paid by the nuclear industry, or Gina Reinhart's paying me, or Clive Palmer, or the Atlas Group or something. I had to actually look up the Atlas Group I'd got no idea who they are, but I'm just a volunteer who is very passionate about keeping trees in the ground and keeping biodiversity and wilderness, because one of our most diminishing resources on Earth is wilderness. Our wilderness areas are getting lost. It's going to get harder and harder for our next generation, future generations, to experience wilderness. And wilderness to me is very, very important. It's a place where I seek solace. To me, it's like walking into a chapel. I need nature. Otherwise, I'd be in a mental institution. So nature is really important. And so when I look at things like nuclear, I think, well, nuclear is a no-brainer, because we can build nuclear next to existing coal plants, utilise existing transmission infrastructure, and I'd have new transmission cutting through state forests and national parks and protected areas. It can give us energy security, energy sovereignty. And you look at the nations that use nuclear, they have the cheapest energy prices on Earth, because those plants run for 60 years, 80 years, potentially even 100 years. And so the cost of energy is so cheap long term.
And we also won't come across the situation that Premier Chris Minns said last week about farmers are responsible for any renewable project. If it's built on your land and that project goes under, you're responsible for the cleanup and of removing it.
Yeah.
that would be an enormous cost to these individuals. So they will have destroyed land, or as we were speaking about earlier, it'll be this rusted, enormous wind tower on their property that will just sit there. It blows my mind that this is the sort of reality that we're living in. People are like, oh, well, that's too bad.
It's really crazy times because we're not getting a balance in the media. I've known about this for years because I know hosts of renewable projects. I'm deeply, deeply aware of what is going on. However, the media is not bringing this to people's attention, that these renewable projects have commercial in confidence agreements with host landowners, and those the onus of the cleanup really at the end of the day falls back onto the landowner. Like I said previously, a lot of these renewable projects are owned by multinational companies. They're all set up as proprietary limited companies, so they're designed to fail without bringing down the parent company. And if they do fail, well, then the onus is onto the landowner to clean up the site. And I can visualise very easily that all these many, many wind towers will be left standing and rusting away for perpetuity, because the host landowner will not have the funds or the resources.
It's the expense of it.
And the it's going to fall back onto the taxpayer to clean up these sites. And again, I go back to nuclear, and nuclear is really the only industry that I know of that is completely responsible for the entire life cycle of the waste, of the entire process. So as a part of the licensing of a renewable, of a nuclear plant, the waste is a part of that process. It has to be managed and dealt with. And waste doesn't concern me. I'd be very happy to store waste in my backyard in a concrete canister. And that's another podcast.
That's something that we get told all the time. It's like, well, what happens to the waste? It's so bad for the environment. And I always try and explain that it's not. And now you have just proven that
I'd rather nuclear waste than 5,000 hectares of solar panels wasting away
And leaching
in Queensland.
This waterways.
Yeah. So Upper Calliope Solar Farm in Queensland, that's a 5,000 hectare solar farm. I can't even imagine 5,000 hectares. Well, I can because I've flown over it in a helicopter. I can see it. For Queensland Conservation Council, I photographed 500 hectares of land clearing for beef.
500, not
500 hectares. So I can visualise 500 hectares of broad-scale land clearing. Kaboom. I can't visualise the 5,000 hectares.
That's another thing. People see the numbers and they just can't. They go, oh, it's like when you talk billions or trillions in a budget, and it seems.
So 5,000 hectares of glass, simmering glass, and all that, and there needs to be all these new substations and power lines. And you think about the waste just from that one project. You know, I've got solar panels. And I had to take mine to landfill just recently. They were 14 years old. So they were 14 years old. I phoned up the installers. I phoned up the manufacturers. Both of them don't exist anymore. They had a 30-year warranty. I had to take them to my local dump and they went straight into landfill because I'm in Mareeba Shire in North Queensland. There's no recycling facility whatsoever. They go straight into landfill. I actually photographed myself pushing them into landfill.
it would have been breaking.
But that's what's happening. That's it. But the rollout is huge. So under the integrated system plan, which is the holy grail of Chris Bowen's rollout, we're going to need somewhere around 600 million solar panels to reach our 2050 target. 600 million solar panels. Both rooftop and utility solar.
Yeah.
And if they last only 14 years, like my rooftop, there's some big problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned before, I don't know how we're going for time, Jamie, because I want to throw some fire. One thing I do want to comment on is just when you said you're having to kind of give up your ideologies. Jamie and I last year met a gentleman during pre-poll at the federal election, April last year, who was in Manly on Manly Corso, black shirt for the Animal Justice Party. Lovely man. You know, here we are giving out flyers. But I asked him, I said, I have a question for you. As a man who's advocating for the Anti-Injustice Party, what do you think about nuclear? And he said, I've got to support nuclear because I'm going to keep trees in the ground to protect owls. So I think there are a lot of people on the left that are having to realise that they've got to move to the right. So on our socials, we put out some things already. Jamie did a reel just a few days ago kind of talking about this stuff with wind turbines. And we've had some people really agreeing. We've had other people that have thrown a spanner in the works at us. So I thought I'd read a few of them. Yeah. One, nuclear is too expensive to build and run and too long to get online. In 30 years' time, when our first reactor would be online, green energy will be 30 years more advanced. What do you have to say to that?
Well, it's going to take that long to get there with renewables anyway.
Good point.
You know, so if you look at the integrated system plan, we need to install 150 gigawatts of new renewables. We also need to install 15 gigawatts of new gas capacity to run when none of the renewables work. So if it's going to take 15 or 20 years with nuclear, well, that's fine, because it's going to take that long with renewables anyway. And the other thing too with nuclear, we've already got a lot of the regulatory framework in place already, because we've got Lucas Heights. We've also got some very smart nuclear engineers in Australia. In actual facts, there's some great nuclear scientists down in Melbourne at university who are developing our very own first micro-reactor. We're already very well advanced with nuclear and safeguards, and a great website for people to go to is Nuclear for Climate, and that's run by a fellow called Robert Parker. And he's a person like me, loves nature. Believes in climate change, but he understands the best way to decarbonise is to phase out coal with like for like nuclear. That's how you get those deep emission cuts. And so go to Nuclear for Climate, and a lot of those answers are there in terms of costs and time frames.
This next one's really interesting because you just mentioned how you could visualize 500 hectares, and you mentioned the need for 5,000 hectares.
Yes.
This person's written on our page, wake up to yourself. Australia has approximately 285 million hectares that are covered by coal and gas licenses. I don't even know what 285 million hectares is now that you've just spoken about the sheer size of 500 or 5,000.
Well, that's huge. It's a huge area. They're licenses for exploration. And like I said before, we need base load. We need the production of heat. We need industries that rely on that type of energy, whether it be coal, gas, hydro, or nuclear. Now, if we want to abandon all that coal and gas exploration and walk away from that, that's a huge amount of royalties. That's going to get lost out of the economy. And I suppose there goes our schools, our hospitals, and all of that through royalties. But if you were to walk away from that, well, then nuclear is really the no-brainer to be able to continue those industries in the country. So walk away from coal and gas, and let's just stick with the uranium. Uranium is really usually a byproduct of copper extraction. So a lot of where the copper is found is where uranium is found. So we've already got those resources. So I'd rather see a uranium mine that can provide nuclear power than coal gas across the whole country.
I really like this one. You've touched on some of it already, but some person says a couple of things to consider. This is with regards to wind turbines and Jamie's post. Firstly, the financial cost. This person says they've heard that each turbine is actually probably 3 or 4 million to erect or to produce. I don't know if that's true. Secondly, the amount of raw materials, some of which are likely sourced from slave labour in places like the Congo. And thirdly, what is the carbon footprint to establish these wind turbines? I don't know the numbers, but I would imagine it would take the majority of their workable life just to repay the establishment cost and to balance its own carbon footprint. So what is the net gain? It would be good to see some credible independent research done on this.
Yeah, and that's a great question because there isn't any really good research done. So the research that has been done on the embedded emissions in the manufacture of solar and wind turbines is being done by the manufacturers. So companies like Vestas, which is the Scandinavian company that builds wind turbines, the Chinese manufacturers of gold wind turbines, they produce the data. And no one has been calculating what is the loss of carbon uptake when you're clearing forests for roads, to install all of these turbines, the diesel that's required to ship all the components into the port, to get all the infrastructure from the port to the site, the 400 person work crew that needs to fly in, fly out for 2 or 3 years through the construction phase, which I've documented. There's a 400 person camp up at Clark Creek, and they've got 3 big 20-foot container generators running diesel non-stop for the work crew. And the cars are horrendous. Is that the trucks, this is heavy, heavy civil earth moving, blasting out mountains with dynamite, moving mountains. So all of those embedded emissions are not in those calculations, I believe. They're just being done. Well, the emissions are just, from the manufacture of those components in the factory. There's a lot of issues around the production of solar panels because a lot of solar panels used to be made in Europe using French nuclear. So it was actually emissions free. So it was actually fairly efficient, or less CO2 emitted in the production of solar panels coming out of Europe. But now most of them, they're all China. So they're all burning coal to make our solar panels, the aluminium and so forth.
It's just wild, Stephen. Is there somewhere that our listeners can go and see what you're documenting? I know your website. Is it all available on there, where your beautiful pictures are also on there to buy?
Well, it's really Rainforest Reserves Australia, which is the organisation that I volunteer in. And so Rainforest Reserves Australia.
We'll make sure we tag that on everything we do.
Well, you're doing amazing work. We need more people like you out there. And as I said in a reel just the other day, where are all the environmentalists and activists? Stand up and protect our land and stop with this recklessness of what's going on. You're destroying our economy and our land in the process. Yes. Keep it up, Steve.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Jamie and Jamie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the JJ Podcast.